Okay. And as you can tell from that little announcement, we are recording this and it will be on our website. That's lwvedina.org as of tomorrow. So if you want to share that information, please feel free to do it because it's important. The more people that know about this, the better off we are. So first of all, before I go ahead and introduce Secretary Simon officially, let me tell you about a couple of things that are coming up for the League of Women Voters Edina and in the near future. One is a Thursday morning meeting on February 8th. That would be at 10 o'clock. And that is about whose decision is it? End of life options. That's going to be presented by Ellen Kennedy, who is a League of Women Voters Edina member and the executive director of World Without Genocide, who lost her husband a little over a year ago and made a commitment to him that she would work to give options for end of life. And the League of Women Voters does support that.
Right.
And
I'm watching on WebEx here.
So, and in the meantime, while I'm thinking, could you all mute your mic so that we don't
we're just getting started.
If you can mute your mic, that would be great. And so that you know, right now, the Minnesota bill, which is in front of the legislature, is based on laws that exist in 10 states, Washington, D.C., and for 280 million people in 11 different countries. Then on March 14th, that's again a Thursday morning, we're going to be talking about end the electoral college, elect the president by direct popular vote. Again, that's something that the League of Women Voters supports. And that is actually a moonshot goal for the League of Women Voters. And we'll be having Rosemary Heilman and Joyce Williams outline what the League of Women Voters is doing in that position. So now on to the main part of this event. I want to say that it's my privilege to welcome Secretary of State Simon. Thank you so much for joining us and speaking on such an important topic. He has served as the Secretary of State since 2015. And in his inaugural address, and I think this is really important, especially in the age that we're in now, he said he would work with anyone of any political affiliation from any part of our state to protect, defend, and strengthen the right to vote in Minnesota. And we've seen some gains in that area. Thank you for all that have made that occur. And also, he's working to help about 4 million people who are eligible to vote and ensure that their election system is fair. Before he became Secretary of State, he was a member of the House of Representatives representing St. Louis Park and Hopkins. So I have already said, please put your mics on mute or turn them off. I guess I should say better than the other. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of his presentation, we will ask Julie Rogers Bascom will ask those questions as time permits. So, and remember, this will be recorded. So, Secretary Simon, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be with you, this time by Zoom, but I've been with you in person before. I'll always come if it works out with my schedule whenever asked, because you really do great work. The League has been an indispensable partner for us statewide, and your particular chapter has been particularly vital and vibrant and really always a great sounding board for us. So I just really appreciate this opportunity. I hope we can have a discussion today. I have some prepared remarks, but then I really am interested in what you have to say. Additions, subtractions, disagreements, pushback, feedback, whatever you have, I'm happy to take that. With me today, or at least joining the call, is Melanie Hazlip, familiar, I hope, to some of you. She's our great director of voter outreach. She is beefing up and staffing up her team as we speak to ready herself and ourselves for this election season. And make no mistake, we are in the election season. This is not about some far off event in November. We're in it right now. As I'm going to mention, January 19th, which is a week from tomorrow, absentee voting starts in our presidential nominating primary contest. That contest is March 5th, but absentee voting starts in 8 days. That's it. So we're in it. It's not some far off thing. So I want to thank you for everything you've done and everything I think you're going to do. I like to say as Secretary of State, and many of you have heard me say this before, but it always bears repeating. I like to say that I and we are in the democracy business. And I think you'll agree that it is a heck of a time right now at this moment in history to be in the democracy business. We are in a presidential election year, as you know. That means 3 different statewide elections in the span of 2024. We have the March 5th presidential nominating primary, for which absentee voting starts in 8 days, as I mentioned. We have the regular August primary. And of course, we have the big show, which is the November 5th general election, where we are going to be voting on President of the United States. There's going to be a lot of intensity. There's going to be a lot of energy. There's going to be a lot of enthusiasm. And that's okay. That's not something to fear or be wary of. This is an office. We're electing the person who's going to be the most powerful person in the country and arguably the world. And so, yeah, a little passion and energy is called for. Absolutely. We just want to make sure that it's channeled in the right direction, channeled in a positive direction and not in a negative direction. And I think Minnesota is well positioned. As many of you know, and I never cease to brag about, we are in most years #1 in the country in voter turnout, including in the last presidential election in 2020, when despite a ton of challenges, I mean, we had a knockdown, drag out presidential election anyway, and then you layer on top of that a once in a century pandemic, and layer on top of that the mis and disinformation that we saw. It was a really challenging environment. Yet, despite all that, we came out ahead. We didn't just pass the test in Minnesota. I'd say that we aced the test. And we were #1 in America in voter turnout yet again. That's what we're shooting for, of course, in 2024. I get asked a lot, as you might imagine, why is that? You know, what is it about Minnesota? Why are we perennially, if not #1, then in the top 2 or 3 or 4? What is it about us? Is it something in the water? Is it just luck? Is it a coincidence? What is it? Well, naturally, I don't think it's any of those things. I think it's primarily 2 things. The recipe for success in Minnesota over years and decades. It's laws and it's culture. Laws and culture. And when it comes to laws, we've got some great ones. The cornerstone, in my judgment, is the fact that we were one of the first states in 1973 to adopt same-day or election day voter registration. That is sort of the jewel in the crown, because it says that it doesn't matter if a person has never registered or voted before, or maybe they did, but they have to change their registration. We don't have a pre-election cutoff. As many of you know, because you've lived in other states, to this day, in most of the rest of America, there is a pre-election cutoff. If you're not registered by 3 or 4, or some cases 5 weeks before a general election, you're out. You can't participate. There is no workaround. There is no secondary strategy. There is no exemption or exclusion or exception or anything like that. You're just done. You can't participate. And since 1973, Minnesota said, no, we don't want to be that way. There is no pre-election deadline. You can waltz right into your polling place on election day, and you can register there, and you can vote there, even if you've never been registered before. And that's been the kind of thing that's been a secret of our success. And this year, we have some great new laws to add. The 2023 legislative session in many ways was transformative, but in this lane, in this way, in the democracy lane, it's no different. So now we have, and we'll have, its implementation won't kick in for a little bit, but we'll have automatic voter registration, which means that anyone who gets or renews a driver's license in Minnesota will automatically, if they're otherwise eligible, if and only if they're a citizen, if and only if they're a resident and meet the age requirements, they will be automatically registered to vote. That's going to be a huge step forward, not only in access, but in security. It's going to strengthen our voting rolls. It's going to make them more accurate at an early date and time. So that's a good thing. We now have pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, getting high school students thinking about themselves as voters before they actually informally are voters. Because we know that if a young person votes that first time that they're eligible to vote at age 18 or 19 or 20 or 21, we know that if they do that, they are far more likely to make it a lifelong habit. So another example is that we just restored the right to vote in Minnesota to people who have left prison behind. We're joining that national movement, which is now approaching majority status of the states, that says that that's the right thing to do. So these are just some examples of ways in which Minnesota is well positioned from the standpoint of laws. No set of laws is perfect. Ours isn't either. And I'm sure there are people on this call who have opinions about laws we ought to add, laws we ought to subtract, and reasonable people can have differences of opinion on that. I'm just saying that from the standpoint of one of the ingredients of our success, which is good laws put on the books over several decades by both Democrats and Republicans, that from that standpoint, we're well situated, not perfect, but well situated to weather storms like COVID, well situated to enable people who want to vote. And it speaks to our commanding, presence when it comes to voting. The fact that most years we're #1 in America, and we were in the last presidential election. So that covers laws. But today I want to focus really, and I've been asked to focus on culture, not in those explicit terms, but I see it as a cultural issue. And the #1 cultural threat to voting for me is not our laws, is not legislation. It's this question of whether we can maintain widespread trust in the system. Put another way, we have a disinformation problem in this country and in this state. We saw it play out in 2020. To some extent, we saw it play out in the 2022 election. And it worries me. And it worries not just me, but people across the country, my colleagues, other secretaries of state, and other watchers of democracy. This idea of mis and especially disinformation, it's a problem. And I think it's the #1 problem for our democracy right now in this day and age. The good news is that we have some proven ways to fight it. And I want to talk about that a little bit. And I am a long-term optimist about democracy in Minnesota and democracy in America. We've weathered a lot of storms, a lot of challenges. Does democracy feel a little bit dinged and dented over these past few years? I would say so, but not overcome, not beaten down, not weakened to the point where we're on the edge of any kind of real crisis. I think that we have the tools necessary to fight back against disinformation and preserve the culture of voting and democracy that has made us such a success in Minnesota. Let me just zoom out for a minute and say to you that when I talk about disinformation, just to clarify terms here, when I talk about disinformation, I'm not talking about disagreement. I think that's very important. I'm not casting anyone who disagrees with me or my worldview as a purveyor of disinformation. That's not what this is about. We should have the argument, and we do, all day long, every day, 365 days a year, about what the system ought to be. What should our election system look like? What laws, for example, should we add? What laws should we subtract? And reasonable, patriotic, honest, ethical Americans and Minnesotans can, should, and do have those arguments all the time. That's not what I mean by disinformation. It's not about disagreement on policy, but disinformation is the intentional spread of knowingly false information about our elections. Knowingly false information that is intentionally spread with the effect of corroding and poisoning our democracy. And when it's done for political purposes, explicitly for political purposes, it is a real problem in this country. It corrodes well-earned confidence in our elections. And at its worst, it can inspire violence. I'm not just talking about January 6, 2021. I am talking about less significant forms that don't get all the attention, like the recent spike in targeting of local election officials. You may have seen that in 6 states recently. Fortunately, Minnesota was not among them. In 6 states, there was suspicious white powder sent to election administrators at the county level. In Colorado, in Arizona, in New Mexico, in Texas, in Georgia. And that, at its worst, is where disinformation, weaponized disinformation, intentionally false information about our election system, that's where it can, at its worst, at its most extreme, that's where it can lead us. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about when I talk about disinformation. And maybe conveniently, I'll use an example that's not from Minnesota, but it's one that still endures. So rewind to the 2020 election. We're in the middle of COVID, and everyone who touched elections, whether in Minnesota or any other state, we could see a mile away what was going to happen in one respect. that we saw that there was going to be a huge uptick, a huge surge in people voting absentee, people choosing to vote from home, people choosing to vote by mail. Why? Because remember, this was 3.5, 4 years ago. People didn't want to go to big spaces where a lot of people were milling around in the middle of COVID. Remember, this was pre-vaccine America. There was a lot of fear and anxiety and confusion and uncertainty. And people didn't want to go places where a lot of people were milling around. In Minnesota, we average 1,000 people per polling place. That's 1,000 people and their droplets milling around in one confined space in pre-vaccine America. And we're no different than other states. So we all saw what was coming. We saw that there was going to be a huge uptick and surge in absentee voting. So in Minnesota, we were then and are now well situated to handle that huge surge in volume in one respect. And stay with me. I know this sounds like an administrative issue, but it really is pertinent to the overall debate. In Minnesota, we have had a longstanding rule that says that the people who count absentee ballots, they get a head start. Usually it's 7 days, but in 2020, at my request, the legislature doubled it to 14 days just for that one election. So they have a 14-day head start. Imagine a mountain of mail in every county in Minnesota, all 87 counties and many cities within Hennepin County like Edina. A mountain of mail slowly building and growing as people send in those absentee ballots. It's bigger, it's bigger, it's bigger, it's bigger. And our rule and law in Minnesota was in that particular year, you get a 2-week head start. The people at Edina City Hall or the people in Ramsey County or Whatton County or St. Louis County or whatever, they got 2 weeks. 2 weeks before the election, they can start digging into that pile of mail and processing the absentee ballots. Pennsylvania had no such law. So going into 2020, they got 0 head start. The law in place in Pennsylvania in 2020 was you can't start opening anything in that mountain of mail, not only until election day, but until the polls close on election day. So 7, 8 o'clock at night in Pennsylvania, you can't even start with that mountain of mail. So my counterpart in 2020 went to her legislature and said, we need what Minnesota has and many other states have. We need some head start. Give us something. If you can't give us 2 weeks, give us 1 week. If you can't give us 1 week, give us 72 hours. If you can't give us that, give us 24 hours. Give us some time to start digging into this mountain of mail. The Pennsylvania legislature said, no, you get nothing. You get no extra time. The predictable result of that decision was that, of course, they were counting ballots on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday and Saturday. That's what everyone told you was going to happen. If you don't have a head start like Minnesota and many states do, of course, you're not going to have results on election night that are full and complete. Of course, in cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and whatever, you're going to have a massive mountain of mail, and it's going to take time to process all those ballots. So to this day, we have national political figures who point to the results in Pennsylvania, say that it was rigged, fixed, and stolen because they say there was a dump. That's the term that's often used at political rallies and elsewhere, a dump of votes in cities like Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. That on election night, there were this many votes, and then mysteriously and in a sinister way, there was a dump of hundreds of thousands of votes that came in after election night. And this, so they say, is evidence that the election there and everywhere was rigged, fixed, and stolen. That was not a dump. That was a valid count of legally cast votes by citizens of the United States who were eligible to vote in that election. It was a count of everyone's vote. And it was the very pace that everyone warned about. It was the very outcome that everyone said would happen, that of course he would be counting for 2 or 3 or 4 extra days if we didn't allow a head start to plow into and dig into that mountain of mail. It's a long explanation, I understand, but I'm telling you what I see as an example of disinformation, which endures at political rallies to this day. To this day. It's not some one-off. You can go Google it yourself. Dump Philadelphia votes or Google dump in Pittsburgh, and you will see prominent political figures to this day talking about that. It wasn't a dump. That is false, provably false. It was the counting of validly cast votes by US citizens. That's what it was. That's what I mean by disinformation, and it is a huge, huge problem. So, you know, you layer onto that some of the amplifiers of disinformation that we've seen since 2020 that make the problem potentially worse. One is the level of language that we're seeing. we're seeing more and more talk about rigging and fixing and stealing elections. We're persistent talk about 2020 and not just 2020, some other elections. And the way that it's showing up is in particularly troubling language from the standpoint of potential political violence. Recent references to people who rigged, fixed, and stole election as vermin, that these folks are vermin. Well, that is pretty historically charged language. You don't need to be a history expert to understand what that means. The idea of seeing people who do certain things as less than human. They're like rats and mice. They're vermin. That's a problem. As is the spread of artificial intelligence. 2020, from the vantage point of early 2024, looks somewhat quaint in regard to some of the technologies. Now we have ChatGPT. Now we have unleashed this technology that can produce deep fake videos or deep fake audios that leave you questioning whether the image you're seeing or the voice you're hearing are the real thing. Are they real and authentic, or are they manufactured and synthetic? That's a problem as well. So what do we do about all this? Instead of just admiring or describing the problem, what do we do about all this? I have some ideas about that I wanted to bounce off of you. We're not just passive participants here. We have an ability to push back and fight back against this disinformation. So what do we do? I think there are at least 3 distinct strategies that have to be part of all of us pushing back against election disinformation. Again, not disagreement, but knowingly false information that is peddled and pushed out there with the intent of influencing the outcome of an election, with the intent of confusing and misleading and misdirecting people. And at its very worst, it has the tendency, at its worst, to foment political violence. So what do we do? One of the things I think we need to do, and this is where the League has been such a valuable partner, both statewide and your chapter, I think we've got to lead with the truth. We have to lead with the truth. When we see or hear or sense people saying false things about the election system, again, what the system is, not what it ought to be, not what someone hopes it should be or will be someday, but when someone describes what is going on with the running of our election in a way that is false, like the Pennsylvania example, we have to speak up about that. We can't let it go unrebutted. And whether that's in our daily conversations or in a sort of mass media sense or a public relations campaign or the information that we provide to the public or the way we talk about things in the public, we have to say the truth about what is really going on. So that's important. The other thing that's important, in my judgment, is to use some empathy. I make a distinction between the people who knowingly and intentionally peddle disinformation and the people who pass it along unknowingly. The people who don't know it to be untrue, in fact, believe it to be true. They're wrong that it's true. It isn't true, but they believe it is so. And they're passing it along either on social media or to their neighbor or their coworker or their friend or their relative or their sibling or their spouse or whoever. And they don't necessarily know all of the details. I mean, I put it this way. I think this is just something that we all observe in life. If someone that we like, know, trust, and respect says something, we're more likely to believe it. I don't care whether it's a movie review or a restaurant recommendation. If someone you know, like, trust, or respect says, hey, that new cafe down at 50th and France, have you heard? Oh my God, it's fantastic. Man, the cheesecake, best ever, right? You're probably going to believe it more, or a movie review or whatever it is. That's just how we all live. This is no different. This space is no different. If someone that a person knows, likes, trusts, or respect, whether I do or you do or not, if they do, and that person says something about the way the Pennsylvania election was run in 2020, they're more apt to believe it. And so it's important to make the distinction and not to label as some intentional purveyor of disinformation, a person who's just passing along something that they believe, they wrongly believe, but they believe, and they believe it to be true. And that's a tough nut to crack. That really is. And it means being, I think, disciplined in some ways to not paint with too broad a brush and to explain in the example of Pennsylvania, no, there's a reason why there were all these votes that came 2 and 3 and 4 days after, and it wasn't a dump and it wasn't someone hacking the machines. It was that there was a huge backlog in processing and counting these ballots. That's just one example, but let's go with that thread. And I think it's important for us to speak up and speak out when we hear that. And there's always that debate, I understand. And we engage in it constantly in our office about when you hear something that's false, if you rebut it in a loud way, are you giving it more oxygen than it otherwise might have, right? By naming it and rebutting it, are you doing the bidding of those who are purveying the disinformation by getting it out there more? Like maybe if you just not said anything, it would go away. And that is always a debate that we have. I'm not saying it's a black and white rule. You have to use your best judgment. But if something you think has the ability to spread that is just plain false, objectively false about how the system operates, not how it should be or ought to be, but how it is, I think it's important for us to provide information and to counteract the disinformation. And then the third thing, and this is something very much in our lane, in our office, is transparency. You know, the more we can give people a glimpse, or more than a glimpse, a long look at the way our election system really functions, I can tell you anecdotally, for sure, almost 100% of the people who come on in and take a look behind the curtain, they walk away with a ton more confidence than they came in with. I can't tell you the number of examples, countless, truly countless, of our partners in counties and cities and towns all over Minnesota who have dealt with someone who has suspicions or even hostility about the election system and showed them what it's like to be an election judge, or invited them into a particular meeting or procedure, or had them or answered their questions about what the law is. They might have heard something about what the law is, false or not, in Pennsylvania or New York. And when you explain to them that, no, that's not how it works in Minnesota, we don't have that law in that other state, or we do have that law that some other state doesn't. The more we can just open up the curtain and show people, not just tell them, but show them what our system is, the more they come away impressed and more confident. So let me give you one example. It's just one. You know that in 2020 and in its aftermath, there were a lot of people making just totally false accusations about certain election machines and elections equipment. In fact, one prominent national vendor, Dominion, got a huge, huge 100 million plus, couple 100 million plus settlement out of Fox News for spreading mis and disinformation about its own product. And the general idea was that you can't trust these election tabulating machines, that Dominion or someone else, they're rigging and fixing elections by switching votes from candidate A to candidate B. So I can't speak for any other state, but in Minnesota, we have something in state law called a public accuracy test, PAT, public accuracy test. And what it means is anyone in Minnesota who owns and uses elections equipment, whether it's the city of Edina or Hennepin County or Watonwan County or Benton County or whatever, they must, it's mandatory, they must, within 2 weeks of every election, whether it's a primary election, a general election, or a special election, they must trot out that elections equipment in a previously noticed public meeting that everyone's invited to. You don't have to live in Edina to go to Edina's public accuracy test. You could live in Bemidji. And likewise, you could live in Edina and go to Bemidji's. And there's no RSVP. You don't need to be a big shot or a VIP or have an engraved invitation. This is publicly noticed in advance. Anyone can go into Edina's public accuracy test. And what happens at these public accuracy tests is the elections administrators in full public view put these machines through their paces and try to trick them. That's the whole goal of the exercise. Try to trick the elections equipment by double voting or undervoting or putting stray marks, or instead of filling in the oval, circling or putting a check mark and see whether it'll count that, and then testing at the end of the exercise whether the numbers match up 100%. 99% is not good enough. 100%, the number of votes cast and the number of votes cast for particular candidates and across multiple contests. So that's what a public accuracy test is. Do hundreds of people show up for these things? No, I've been to many. Sometimes 2 people show up or 1 person shows up. But I've tried to bring more attention to this process with TV cameras and microphones in tow, because I don't expect Minnesotans far and wide to attend public accuracy tests. They've got lives and families and jobs and interests. But the more we can tell Minnesotans that they exist, the more peace of mind I know that we're providing. So when someone sees a trusted political figure, trusted to them, say, oh, you can't trust this equipment, it's rigged, it's changing votes, it's hacked. We hope that Minnesotans will say, or at least think to themselves, well, that may be in that other state, but I know I heard this thing on the news, what's it called, public something or the other, where they kind of test all this stuff before the election. I couldn't go, I have to be at work at 8, but I guess they did this down at Edina City Hall and do this everywhere in Minnesota. So that's good. It sounds like we're on that one. That's probably not a big worry in Minnesota. So the more we can publicize this stuff, it's not about people attending necessarily, although that would be great. But it's about publicizing that this even exists. So when you meet a skeptic in your life who said, well, I heard candidate so-and-so say you can't trust these machines, that, they're being infiltrated and they're changing votes, you can say, hey, well, we have this thing in Minnesota. You're welcome to go, but if you can't, do you know that before every election, we've got this stuff? So that's one example. Another example is at the other end of the election process. We have mandatory post-election audits and reviews in Minnesota to match up exactly every ballot cast. Every single county in Minnesota has to do them. They can't shrug it off. They can't blow it off. They got to do them. And then our office reviews that work as well. So we've got multiple layers before, during, and after the election. And it's important that our office and our partners at the local level are as transparent and open and loud about it as possible. Because when people who come in with a skeptical attitude, which is okay, this is America, it's okay. Sometimes it's a duty to be skeptical. And it's a very healthy thing to be skeptical and ask tough questions of your government. People should. But when they have those questions, there are answers for those questions. And in Minnesota, the best thing we can do is not just tell, but show. Show people, come on in. You're worried about the equipment? Go to a public accuracy test in your city or any others. Check it out, ask tough questions. Watch them as they're looking under the hood and putting it through these tests. Same goes with the end of the election. Are you worried that, what was reported on election night is not backed up by the actual paper ballots? Go to the publicly noticed, open to the public audits and reviews that happen in all 87 counties at the other election. If you can't go, have a friend go, or someone with your political organization go and watch the watchers. So go do it. So that's an antidote to some of this stuff as well. I don't need to tell you all that this is a big election year. 2024 will be a busy year for all of us in the democracy business. I include you in that. It's not just government, it's League of Women Voters and others who are watching and nurturing our democracy. As I mentioned, we're going to have 3 elections, and the one that comes up most quickly is the March 5th presidential nominating primary. We are part of what is known as Super Tuesday, a term familiar to many of you, which means March 5th is a big day. It's a date on which many states are going to be doing the same thing as we're doing. And nomination contests are really decided very often on or by that day. So we're just very close, 8 days away from the start of that election season in Minnesota. January 19th, Minnesotans will be able to cast their vote by absentee. And of course, as many of you know, there are 2 ways to vote absentee. One is to vote from home, and people can go to our website, which is mnvotes.gov, and they can order the ballot to come to them. Or they can vote in-person absentee. If you're in Edina, that would be at Edina City Hall. And to find out where that is for any community, you can also go to our website at mnvotes.gov and find out, if you live anywhere in Minnesota, where in-person absentee voting would happen for you. And of course, there's voting on game day itself, March 5th. We'll have 3,000 polling places, as we always do throughout Minnesota. So that's going to be very, very important. This is a fairly new process in Minnesota, remember. 2020 was our first presidential nominating primary in decades. And this is our second run. We've learned a lot from the first run. Remember, the parties used to do their delegate allocation process through the caucus system and not through an actual election. But that changed after the 2016 election for a lot of reasons. So 2020 was a great year to start it. And this is our second time as well. Just a reminder, as I'm sure many of you know, but as you're reaching out to folks, this is a different kind of animal in another way, one that we're not normally used to doing, which is there are separate ballots in this contest for separate political parties. We're going to have 3 different major political parties having a presidential primary that day. The DFL party, the Republican Party, and the Legalize Marijuana Now party is also going to have a presidential primary. And the voter has to choose which ballot to vote. Remember, that's a very different kind of deal than our regular primary in August, where we're also voting intra-party. You're either voting for candidates under the DFL banner or candidates under the Republican banner or Legal Marijuana Now banner, but there it's all on one ballot. You don't have to choose. Here you do have to choose. So in the example of someone who goes into a polling place, you have to tell the election judge, please give me the Republican Party ballot for president. Please give me the TFL party ballot for president, and so on. So that's different. That's not something people are used to. But that's just a note of caution to folks. And there are some people who are uneasy about that, about having to choose a ballot. Remember, Minnesota does not have party registration. Most states do. We're one of 18 states that do not. 32 do, and 18 do not. So some of you have lived in these other states where when you register to vote, you can, if you wish, register as a Democrat or register as a Republican or register as an independent. We've never had that anytime since statehood in Minnesota. We just register. There's no one asking for your party affiliation. It's not even optional. You just register and that's it as a Minnesotan. So we are in the minority, but what it means is, culturally speaking, we're not used to that. We're not used to sort of having to tell someone, even an election judge on election day, give me this particular party's ballot. It's typically been a secret further, and there are reasons for that. And ultimately, my dream is that we do an August style date going forward. I'd love to see it on one ballot where nobody knows. Nobody knows which party's primary that you voted in. Here in Minnesota, we tightened the law considerably. My dream is to have it like our August primary, but in Minnesota, at least now, it's not public information which ballot you chose. Let's say you chose the Republican Party ballot. Nobody knows that except the Republican Party. They will know, but the public won't know. The other parties won't know. They will know. And the argument by the parties is, well, this is sort of like a sign-in sheet. If you attended a political party event and they had a sign-in sheet, you wouldn't think that unreasonable. You attend their event, you sign in, it's okay for them to know, but it's not okay for anyone else to know. I'd like to go farther, as I say, and I'd like to go to the August primary style where we don't have any of this going on. But that's just a reminder for all of you as well. And I just want to say a word, speaking of disinformation, about voting from home or voting by mail, because that really is the reform that got us through COVID, that got us through 2020. It was actually my bill in the legislature when I served in the Minnesota House in 2013. And I couldn't have, and none of us could have known in 2013, that that's the legislation that would basically save the election in 2020, because people weren't too keen, as I mentioned, on going to places with a lot of people around. So we saw a huge surge. 58% of voters in 2020 voted absentee, 58%. Put another way, only 42%, a minority, voted the standard traditional way by going physically to a polling place on election day, 42%. Now that number came back down to earth again to somewhere in the mid-20s in 2022 for sure, because the worst of COVID was past. But the point is, it's a great way for people to vote if that's the way that they choose. And we have numerous security features in Minnesota that make it an excellent way to vote, and a vote way that people really enjoy voting, COVID or not. And sometimes, and I don't blame people, by the way, I don't place blame, I don't question motives. Sometimes people will ask me this about mail voting, and it's a totally legitimate question. They'll say, look, here's my worry about voting by mail, Steve. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of blank, empty ballots going out by mail, just going into mailboxes across neighborhoods across Minnesota because people ordered them. What's to prevent a mailbox thief from camping out in a neighborhood in Edina, knowing that the city of Edina, let's say, mailed theirs on a Wednesday, and camping out by mailboxes on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and the following Monday, camping out in neighborhoods and stealing 10 or 100 or 1,000 blank ballots, totally blank, stealing them out of mailboxes and then voting those ballots? What's to keep them from doing that? It's a great question. I would ask the same. Here are the security features which make that close to impossible. So in Minnesota, if you remember, when you order an absentee ballot, when you go to mnvotes.gov, our website, and say, yeah, I'd rather vote at home, send me the ballot to where I live. When you do that, you have to provide some personal identifying information. You have to provide either your driver's license number or part of your social security number or something else, some personal identifying information, you, the intended voter, and then you get the ballot mailed to you. And the ballot, upon return, will only be counted if three things are true. First, the very same personal identifying information that the intended voter used is on the ballot going back the other way. Second, the intended voter signs the ballot. There's a signature requirement. And third, a witness who's eligible to vote in Minnesota also signs it. Unless all three of those things are true, it will not be counted. Put another way, back to the mailbox thief. unless the mailbox thief knows which particular form of personal identifying information the intended voter used when he or she ordered it, knows it and puts it in on the return ballot, and forges their signature, and forges a witness's signature. Unless all three of those things are true, that ballot sent back will be destroyed. It will not be counted. So the clever mailbox thief thinks he's being real clever, isn't being clever at all. He's not going to get away with anything, and hasn't. I don't know the last time, I literally do not know the last time in Minnesota we've had an instance of that kind of misconduct. I can't tell you. There isn't one from the 2022 election. There's not one that I've seen from the 2020 election. You'd have to go back many, many years because of those triple layers of security in Minnesota. So it is very much a secure way of voting, a way that we got through COVID, but more than that, a way that increasingly people just choose to vote. So I don't blame people for asking that hypothetical question. It's a good one. It's a good one, and one that should be asked. How do I know it's secure? Blank ballots by the hundreds of thousands? My God, isn't that a gaping security hole? Great question and fair question. But the answer is we have triple layers of security in Minnesota that make it virtually impregnable. A system that is very, very secure and honest and has a lot of integrity to it. And that other states are copying, by the way. Not many states have those triple layers. We do. So that's just something as we go into this election season that's important. I talked about the public accuracy test. I talked about post-election reviews and certification. Those are the items of our system that I think ought to inspire confidence and ought to have Minnesotans continuing to believe that our system is fundamentally fair, accurate, honest, and secure. There are many ways to measure voter confidence, no question about it, but surely one way to measure it, one good way, is voter turnout. And I just don't think Minnesota would be #1 in the nation in voter turnout again and again and again and again if a sizable part of our population truly believed in their heart that it was a corrupt system. I think the opposite is true. The vast majority of people in Minnesota, whether they agree with all parts of the system, whether or not they'd like to see additions or subtractions or changes, they know that fundamentally our system is fair, accurate, honest, and secure. It's a system of honesty. It's a system that has integrity, and they know that. Otherwise, they wouldn't waste their time voting in such sky-high numbers year in and year out. So we've got a good thing going, but we know that this year in particular, that cultural piece of our success, that confidence in election is under threat because you have political actors and others spreading knowingly false information that is designed to, and sadly often does, corrode well-earned faith in our democracy. We can't let that happen. It's not good for anyone. I don't care how someone votes. I don't care which party. I don't care which candidate. My job is to make sure that people who want to vote can vote and that they understand the many safeguards, the many guarantees of trustworthiness in our system. And you, the league, both generally and specifically as of this chapter, you have been outstanding and insightful partners in this work. And I want to thank you for that and generally being partners of mine in the democracy business. Thanks for your time and attention. And I'm happy now to field whatever questions, comments, pushback, feedback that you have.
Let me first say thank you, Secretary Simon, for that wonderful information. It's great to hear it from you directly. And I think that we all need to consider ourselves in the democracy business. You're the general, but we are there to, as privates and ensigns and whatever, to help make it happen. And I would encourage everyone on this call to do that, as he suggested. So Julie, why don't you, are there any questions in the chat that you have seen?
Yes, we have we have several. Let's start off, excuse me, a question from Becky. If an absentee ballot is not received by the applicant due to the mailbox thief or other reasons, what does the voter do? How long should they wait for their ballot to arrive before becoming concerned?
That is a great question. I mean, obviously, some of it depends on where you live because we don't do that centrally. It depends on the office from which you order it, you know, whether it's the city of Edina or Hennepin County or another county around the state. But I would say if you order a ballot and it's not there within a week or 10 days, you should start asking some questions at least. The good news is I know this wasn't precisely the question, but we have a lot of precision when it comes to the other way. So once you've filled out your ballot, I want everyone in Minnesota to know that you aren't left wondering whether it got there and was counted. We have a tracking system, just like an Amazon or UPS package or anything else, where you can track the arrival. You can know for certain that it was received and that it was processed. You don't have to stick it in the mailbox, say a prayer, and hope that they get it and count your ballot. But on the way to you, when you order that, yeah, I would give it a week. I would give it 10 days before you start asking really tough questions. Did a mailbox thief come and steal this? And he's going to be very disappointed when he figures out, oh, wait, I need to know this person's social security or driver's license number, and I've got to forge their signature, and I've got to forge a witness signature. I guess this wasn't such a smart idea. That's the best answer I can give.
Another question from Ellen: what future election legislation would further strengthen democracy?
Yes, well, thank you. We've got some ideas, as you might imagine. We have a very busy legislative shop. 2023 was a huge transformative year in many ways, and there were some real impactful legislation in this space. The tradition in Minnesota, and it's a good one, is things are a little slower in the election year. We don't want to be passing a lot of new laws that affect election administration in the election year. It's good to give it a little bit of a breather. That's not to say we won't be active this session. So let me give you some examples. One is, and this is particularly important for people who are experiencing homelessness or who live in areas such as Native American Indian reservations where there isn't a regular street and grid address system. We want to do what the federal government already allows on its voter registration forms and allow people to register to vote with approximations or landmarks. Hey, I live a half a mile from the fork in the river, or I live, on Nicollet Avenue between this street and that street. I don't have a precise address right now, but here's where I live. Those kinds of things, which many other states have done, which the federal government has done for years on their federal registration form. We want to do that in Minnesota. There are other reforms that we're going to be urging and pushing when it comes to voting on Native American reservations as well. Things like making voter registration easier and so forth. So that's an example of things that in the coming days we're going to be talking about. Another thing that is somewhat defensive is there have been some real weakening of and attacks on the federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. There was a recent court case as well that weakens, in my view, some of its core protections. It'll probably be headed to the U.S. Supreme Court. But so there's been talk, and we've been talking with legislative partners about implementing to some extent a Minnesota version of the Voting Rights Act that would at least restore what one court has taken away, which is the ability of people and groups like the League of Women Voters to have standing to sue under certain provision of the Voting Rights Act. This recent court decision took that away and said there's no what they call a private right of action, that if there's a violation of this act, that only the Attorney General of the United States can sue, and that individuals can't, and that groups like the League of Women Voters can't. And we want to restore that on a state level basis. So that's something that we're talking about as well. Those are just some examples.
Some questions about absentee ballots. If Kathy asks if absentee ballots are counted early and the totals released, could that lead to election mischief?
They are not counted early. They are, and that's why I was careful in my language, and I get this a lot, and it's a great question. They are processed. They have a head start in processing absentee ballots, but there is no tallying of absentee ballots. What do I mean by process? Well, when an absentee ballot comes in, you first have to determine the three things I said. Processing is more than just counting. So you get this envelope, okay, did they return it with the personal identifying information? Did they remember to sign it? Did they remember to have a witness sign it? If not, we got to get back to them and tell them their ballot is defective. And by state law, you have to get back to them and tell them how they can cure that defective ballot. So they are processed 2 weeks in advance, but they are not tallied until election night. That's an important distinction. So don't worry. No, there's no tally and nothing is public. Nobody goes into election day saying, oh, candidate A, based on the absentees, she's got this many votes. Doesn't happen in Minnesota. It's unlawful for that to happen, and it doesn't happen.
A question around college students finding a Minnesota registered voter in their out-of-state college.
Yes, great point. So not just out of state, but some people are out of the country. Yes. So finding someone who witness, but the deal is you can also have a notary. You can have a notary.
Okay.
So that's something that college students sometimes do in other states as well, and it works out quite well.
What safeguards do we have in Minnesota to prevent cyber attacks
Yes.
in the voting process?
Great question. So 2016 was the hinge moment of history, not just in Minnesota, but in this country when it comes to the threat of outside cyber attacks. That was the election, you'll remember, where Minnesota was one of 21 states whose election system was targeted by, fortunately unsuccessfully in our case, but targeted by a cyber attack by a foreign government. Now, our systems worked, the defenses worked, no one got in. But in 2 states, Illinois and Arizona, they did get in a little bit. Not super far, but they did get in. And that was the wake-up call. That really was the wake-up call. And I can divide election administration in this country in 2 halves, pre-2016 and post-2016, because post-2016, the cybersecurity front became very real and something that we in our office, and I think every office, devoted a ton of time and attention and energy and resources to. So we now have, we didn't in 2016, we, all the states, have a really strong and robust partnership with the intelligence services in this country. We get secret level security clearances. It's 1 level below top secret, but it's still high. We all of us, we get secret level clearances, and we get regular briefings. I go to the FBI headquarters, the Minneapolis FBI headquarters, in a secure room, and we get regular intelligence briefings about not just foreign threats from foreign actors, but even other threats when it comes to cybersecurity. Congress has come up with a good bit of money to make sure that we can staff up and protect against those threats. We have regular what's called penetration testing exercises that the federal government conducts, where they come in and they try to hack us. They literally try to hack us. They try to penetrate our systems. They find weaknesses. They find vulnerabilities. They impersonate. They do everything they can to mess us up. And then they write a report, and we end up meticulously going through it with them, and in some cases spending a lot of money to plug those holes. So while no system is perfect, and neither I nor any other elections person around the country could tell you there's a 100% chance everything will go well and a 0% chance anyone can get in, that would be false to tell you. But what I can tell you is I feel really, really good about where we are, the resources we've deployed, the partners that we have, the learning we've done over the last few years since 2016. And I think we're very well positioned in Minnesota to do as we've done always, which is repel any attempts to get in and hack us.
Just one comment from Darcy. She said she has 2 sons who are active duty U.S. Marines. Thank you for their service, Darcy.
Yes.
But they have followed successfully. They have successfully voted by mail, followed their ballots while in service, no matter where they were stationed. She mentions Djibouti, Africa. So a statement to the system.
Great. I'm so happy to hear that, particularly with service members overseas. That's something we care about a lot. At the last deployment of Minnesota National Guard troops abroad, just a couple, 2-3 weeks ago, we were there with voting information so that people had the same information that your sons have about how to do it. The military, all branches, have been a really good partner for us, and I'm really happy to hear that success story.
On the other side, Evelyn talks about Mankato mailboxes were broken into in December. Any comment about post office security and also the need for maybe having more polling places in a city or county?
That's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard about that in Mankato. I definitely would have heard about it had there been any ballots involved. But, you know, as I mentioned, we have those 3 layers of security for absentee ballots. Always distressing when you get mailbox theft of any kind, whether it's stealing a check or anything else, or a ballot, whatever it is. In terms of polling places, that is a distinctly local decision. And there's been a pretty long-standing and strong consensus in terms of keeping it local. So it's cities and counties in some cases which decide polling places, not our, not our office. And they have to do it in a way, though, that empowers their voters. They can't do it under law by ways that tend to depress turnout. They can't, there's a big city, they can't cluster them all on the east side so that no one on the west side or the south side or the north side has a polling place. They have to, within certain legal principles, make sure it's reasonably accessible to everyone. So that's their decision about the number of polling places and the placement of polling places.
Another question, they keep coming in, Secretary Simon, thank you for
Good.
your time. I know we'll be wrapping up shortly. How widespread is recording of election machine tests prior to an election? Do most election officials do this for public viewing later?
Recording as in like video recording and then playing it back later?
Cindy, can you turn your mic on and clarify that question?
Hi. Yeah, Secretary Simon, you were talking about you having your recording equipment in to look at the process. I was wondering if that is something typically that most election offices do, so they can make that available to the public if that session isn't well attended, or just to make sure it's generally
I see.
available.
That's a great question. No one's ever asked me that before. Honestly, I don't know the answer about how many of them record it, but it's a great idea. I'm going to actually make a note of that and pass that along for people who are experiencing, members of the public who want to know, but they can't attend. They're working, or they've got family commitments, or they're out of town, or whatever the good reason is. Why not encourage people to record it so that if someone who is skeptical or hostile or curious or whatever says, okay, I couldn't make it, but how do I know that you were asking the right questions or doing the right things? I like the idea of making it more widely available to record so that people can watch afterwards. That's a great idea.
He's writing it down. A follow-up comment from Cindy, the targets in Mankato were gift cards and cash prior to the holidays. Following up on that. All right, let me see if there's another. Catherine talks about, I received an application for a permanent absentee ballot, although I didn't apply for one. In the past, I voted at the city county courthouse. Is that considered absentee?
Yes. Voting anytime other than election day, whether you do it from your kitchen table or whether you do it in person at the courthouse or city hall or whatever, that's absentee voting, right? Anything other than game day voting is absentee voting, right?
Have the major parties joined in a large way in your efforts to reassure voters this?
Well, I'll put it this way, we have to be careful. We're not, I mean, we work with parties on certain things, of course, but always have to be careful that we always do it together. We never work, with just one party, or we make sure they're all in the room. But I would say this, here's one way to answer this question. And it's a positive thing. I think that there is a return. I'm seeing more of a return now.
And answer back to the.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, there's been a return to some agreement, which was gone for a few years, about certain kinds of voting. As you know, there was some in some political circles who were very skeptical of, if not hostile to, voting by mail. But more and more, you're seeing a return to the consensus that existed before 2016, that this was a good thing to make available to people. And it was even in the interests of political parties and their candidates to, as they often call it, bank their votes early. Meaning, if you're a strong Democrat or strong Republican and you're working for a particular party or a party's candidates, you want to bank those votes early. You want to get your supporters to get the votes in before. You never know what's going to happen on election day, right? There could be an illness or an accident or a weather issue or whatever. So parties, at least in the run-up to 2016 and the immediate aftermath, were in agreement about, for their partisans and their supporters, hey, encouraging people to vote early. I'm not saying one way or another whether voting early is right or wrong for a particular person, but I'm saying they were doing that. And then one particular political party spent a few years not doing that. And now they're coming back to doing it like the other parties are doing. So that's, I think, a helpful and encouraging sign. But yes, I go to great pains when I have these meetings to meet with all of them at the same time so that everyone's hearing the exact same information. They're not separate meetings. I always have meetings with the major parties where we have it physically if possible and we're all there. So no one can say I said one thing to one group and one thing to the other group. Everyone is getting the exact same information. And yes, generally speaking, I'm hopeful about some of the signs I'm seeing about multi-partisan cooperation on just the rules, what the rules are. You might not like what the rules are, but getting good information out there to voters about what the rules are.
And our final conversation, I know there've been other, or final question, there've been other questions, and hopefully there are other ways that we can respond to some of the other questions. But our final question today is, are there penalties for publicly spreading misinformation, in this case,
Yes.
election misinformation in Minnesota?
Yes. So there was a new law passed in 2023, which says that if someone spreads, two things have to be true. They spread false information, knowingly false information. That's number one, knowingly false, not just what they're spreading is false. They know it to be false when they spread it. And they do it for the purpose of interfering with someone's right to vote. Both things have to be true. It's a very high bar and high standard, and it should be. We have a First Amendment in this country, and we all cherish and honor it and want to nurture it. But if both of those things, it's a very high standard. Not much is going to meet that, frankly. If you knowingly spread false information and you do it with the intention of interfering with someone's vote, then that is actionable. That is unlawful. A court could order the person, it could impose penalties and order the person to stop doing it. And so that's important. Again, a high bar, a high standard. It should be, and it is, but that's a new law now on the books in Minnesota.
Great, thank you. And at this point, I'm going to ask Colleen to hop in and wrap things up for us today.
Well, thank you, everyone that has been so attentive and asked questions, and especially to you, Secretary Simon, in the democracy business. And as you said, League of Women Voters is also in the democracy business. And it was really reassuring to me to hear that you're looking at Indigenous and others so that we make democracy work for all. And, you know, we often say that, and sometimes we don't really get a chance to do that, but I'm happy to hear that you as Secretary of State are working on that. And we as League of Women Voters and others in the community are interested in this. So again, this will be on our website, LWVEdina.org tomorrow. And please feel free to share that information with your friends and those that you want to convince that our elections are safe and we don't want misinformation and so on and so forth. And I'll just mention, the League of Women Voters Edina is having a probably close to monthly column in our little local newspaper. And I'm going to put some of that information that you shared with us about the PAT and so forth in, so that our community members know that these things exist. Our next one is going to be the election schedule. And as I said, we'll likely have 5 elections in Edina this year. I know there's 3 across the state, but we've got the Hennepin County Commissioner, probably a primary and certainly a special election. But we'll get more information out to our community members so that they too become partners in making democracy work. So with that, thank you so much. And we always appreciate hearing from you. And to everyone, have a good year and go 2024. We'll make it work.